The Hall of Abstract Concordance shimmered in hues no human eye had ever seen, carved from the living crystal of Tarvan, a moon city orbiting the gas giant Myrex. Within its cyclopean spires, the Council of Intellectual Harmonies gathered every 11 rotational spans to debate, archive, and judge the philosophical progress of galactic civilizations. 31 species sat in curated silence. Their shapes were diverse: plasma-wrapped intellects, arthropodal synthesists, sentient gas clouds, yet they shared a unifying trait: absolute certainty that humanity was irrelevant. It had been just over 2 Earth decades since Sol had been tagged as a sentient bearing system. An automated Vilari survey probe had detected signs of digital reasoning and crude orbital mechanics. The report filed humanity as a Tier 0 emergent bipedal subspecies, promising but unrefined, curious perhaps in the way a larval fungus is curious before it dies under scrutiny. Emotion-led, conflict-prone, paradoxically irrational, high evaluator Sailro of the Aelthais intoned, his eightfold voice projecting across the hall. Their recorded thinkers contradict with fervor, their logic folds upon itself in recursive confusion. Primitive semiotics dominate their records, they engage in recursive myth as knowledge synthesis. A chorus of subtle affirmations rippled through the chamber. Their mathematics are cluttered with symbolic redundancies, added Jothex of the Shimmering Ones, a cognitive gestalt comprised of 7 refractive beings. Even their language lacks precision. They name variables after animals and deities. Their philosophical musings loop through contradiction with no terminal insight. The judgment was clear. Humans were creative in the way unstable weather was creative. They stirred, scattered, destroyed, repeated. They were noise mistaken for signal. A ceremonial decree was passed to restrict Earth's access to the greater archives of thought. Observation only status, no membership, no discourse, a footnote to be monitored but not engaged. None objected, the council returned to their endless dialectics. Then one walked in. It was on the 70-second span of the third alignment when the hall's veil shimmered with unexpected kinetic variance. An unauthorized presence blinked into being before the grand podium. Security constructs rippled to attention but paused. The being standing at the center was recognized by the Accord's automated heuristic: Homo sapiens, Earth origin, unarmed. He wore rugged boots still caked with Martian regolith. His jacket bore the sigil of the United Terran Cooperative, flanked by faded mission patches. A dark, weather-beaten backpack hung from his shoulders, mismatched straps strapped tight. He was breathing hard, clearly winded by whatever method he had used to bypass nearly a dozen nested transit protocols and quantum security grids. He straightened and cleared his throat. "I'm Lieutenant Jason Rourke, human, UTC Expeditionary Corps Science Division. I heard you've been talking about us." Silence held, tension spiked. One of the elder Arasari, a psionically attuned race that resembled bipedal coral formations, leaned forward. "You are not authorized to be here. This is a sanctum of elevated discourse." Rourke shrugged. "Well, your quarantine of Earth thought kinda ticked off a few people back home, so I volunteered to crash the party." "Volunteered," repeated Sailro, tasting the word as if it were a sour chemical. "Yeah," Rourke replied, dropping the backpack to the floor with a heavy thud. "You ever try reasoning with a civilization by reading its sanitized transmissions, you're missing everything that makes us us." Security drones hovered closer. "You dare impose your presence without invitation and presume your primitives possess something of value?" asked Jothex, its body refracting annoyance into shimmering ripples. Rourke knelt and unzipped the bag. "I didn't come with weapons, I came with data, not the sanitized export feeds you intercepted. I brought the real stuff. The messy stuff, books, not ebooks, real ones, handwritten notes, obsolete code, music from 1,000 subcultures, the wild theories of half-mad physicists, stories written by people who died in poverty, arguments that tore apart empires, diaries from explorers who froze to death trying to reach knowledge." He pulled out a battered book. It was wrapped in protective polymer. The title was burned into the leather: Gödel, Escher, Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid. Douglas Hofstetter, 1979, Self-Referential Cognition, Recursive Identity, Symbolic Logic Meets Art and Music. You folks said our logic loops. Yeah, it does, that's the point. That's how our minds evolve, not linearly, not cleanly. We don't just build upon axioms, we challenge them, break them, reassemble them into something else. The hall began to shift, its crystalline surfaces resonating with analytical pulses. Machines of thought began parsing Rourke's speech. A member of the T-Scren, a race whose brains were partially temporal, blinked in stuttering pulses. Irregular data influx, unfiltered, no consensus alignment, high entropy content, dangerous to archive integrity. That's what truth is, Rourke said, spreading out more texts, handwritten schematics, psychological maps drawn in coffee-stained ink, pages full of metaphor and contradiction. We don't seek a consensus first. We explore the outliers, the impossibilities, the failures. That's where the new comes from. High Evaluator Sailrow rose from the central dais, unfolding to his full height, a symphony of bioluminescent pulses surrounding his form. Human, your species has not even solved its own internal coherence. You embrace internal conflict as progress. That is not wisdom, it is chaos. Rourke looked up, eyes cold and steady. No, it's risk, and risk is how evolution leaps forward. You call that chaos because your systems fear collapse, we call it potential. Sailrow's light patterns froze. Rourke walked to the display pedestal, a space sacred for only the most refined thought constructs, and laid down something absurd. A crumpled notebook filled with personal equations, poetic scribbles, and philosophical questions with no answers. This is the soul of human thought, not filtered, not refined. This is a 19-year-old student on Earth trying to solve problems they don't understand, using tools they barely grasp in a world that doesn't listen, and still trying anyway. And in that moment, something shifted. The T-Scren archivist tilted its triocular gaze and whispered across the shared data stream, "It is raw, it lacks cohesion, but it is a form of proto-thought catalysis. It initiates unpredictable innovation chains." A low murmuring ripple passed through the gathered species. One of the eldest among the Lumeri, an aquatic neural collective that rarely spoke, activated its voice node. "We would review this content." Sailrow hesitated. It was unprecedented. Jothex glimmered with analytical uncertainty. A single data carrier, a primitive, and yet there is noise in his signal that corrupts the pattern or enhances it. Rourke met their gazes. "We're not here to fit your molds, we're here to break them. That's what we do, that's what we've always done. If you want a predictable, sterile species, there are thousands, but if you want something that can change everything, you're looking at it." The hall did not speak again that cycle. But the gates to the archives did not close. And Lieutenant Jason Rourke was given temporary access under the clause of anomalous thought containment and study. The Council believed it would be a containment effort. They were wrong. The provisional access granted to Jason Rourke was formalized with a cautionary clause embedded deep within the Accord's legal framework, an old provision meant for the handling of contagious thought forms originating from unstable civilizations. He was assigned a guardian observer, a Silithian named Vorquest, whose duty was to monitor and intercept any philosophical contaminant he might accidentally propagate. Vorquest regarded the human with clinical detachment. His body was sleek, serpentine, adorned with fractal antennae attuned to cognitive resonance shifts. Rourke, by contrast, carried himself with a casual, almost irreverent slouch, as if unaware or unimpressed by the grandiosity of the hall or the stakes now weighing against him. "You will confine your explorations to the yellow tier," Vorquest instructed, gliding beside him as they entered the first archive. "You are not authorized to disseminate, only to present when requested. Any breach will result in your immediate removal." Rourke nodded. "Understood. I'm not here to start a riot, just show you what you're missing." The yellow tier was a universe of thought vaults, each holding the distilled cognitive achievements of species older than humanity's continents. Rourke moved between crystal nodes, absorbing glimmers of hyperlogic theorems, ethical constructs evolved beyond mere morality, and mathematical artistry that transcended dimension. And yet at every turn he felt the same sterile undercurrent, completeness. These civilizations had built beautiful, perfect cages for their minds. They evolved until innovation became minimal risk, progress reduced to marginal refinement. Rourke's backpack weighed heavily at his side, filled with the chaotic heritage of a species that had never learned when to stop. After 2 cycles of allowed research, the first breach came. Not by Rourke's hand, but by those who listened. A contingent of Sithari scholars, crystalline organisms with minds like interwoven probability webs, approached him. They were notorious for their orthodoxy, yet something about Rourke's presence had disturbed their symmetry. "We have analyzed your notebook," one said in a choral intonation. "The manner of your self-directed contradiction, the unrefined oscillation between conjecture and negation, it suggests pathways we have not explored." Rourke grinned. "You mean you're curious?" They shimmered with an uncertain hue. Curiosity is not the correct term, it is necessity, our model's plateau. He swung his backpack around, digging through until he found what he was looking for, a battered volume of Earth's most defiant thinkers, the philosophy of doubt. He handed it over. "You want more here, doubt everything, especially yourselves." The Sithari took the book with a delicacy reserved for dangerous relics. Vorquest reported the incident immediately. The council convened emergency deliberations. There was a fracture growing at the edges of the Accord's intellectual consensus, a fracture born not of violent rhetoric or technological threat, but of an idea that had no native defense, creative doubt. In the private chambers of the Aelthi's delegation, Sailro seethed. "It begins as a trickle," he warned. "Unbound cognition invites entropy. If we allow this contagion to spread, we risk ideological collapse." Others disagreed. "There is strength in adaptive instability," argued the Lumary's thought weaver. "This human model of self-contradiction births novelty at rates we have not replicated." "We are not primitives to be lured by chaos," snapped Sailro. "We are stewards of ordered ascent." But already secret gatherings formed within the hall. Minor delegates met in cloistered rooms to pore over human artifacts smuggled from Rourke's bag. Music, untranslatable poetry, blueprints for impossible machines designed by dreamers and discarded by practicalists. To many, it was an intoxicating glimpse into a mode of thought their own civilizations had bred out in favor of perfect, stifling harmony. The real catalyst, however, was yet to come. It happened during the Fifth Assembly of Philosophical Constructs when Rourke, still under heavy surveillance, was invited to present a curiosity demonstration to the lower scholars. He didn't bring equations or logical proofs. Instead, he unfolded a large, stained canvas. Upon it was a diagram of human conflicts, discoveries, collapses, renaissances, all interconnected by winding lines and scribbled notations. It wasn't clean, it wasn't ordered, but it pulsed with something undeniable. He pointed to it. "This is how we think, this is how we grow. We don't aim for the perfect circle, we embrace the jagged path. Every failure feeds into the next ascent. Every broken system births something unpredicted." The audience, initially restrained, leaned closer. Many species had hidden away their histories of failure, regarding them as shameful deviations. Humans wove their failures into myths, lessons, drives for the next attempt. Rourke continued, "You see conflict and instability as things to suppress. We see them as forces to channel. We evolved in a crucible of unpredictability. Our greatest leaps weren't born because we refined perfection, they happened because we survived imperfection." At the edge of the hall, Vorquest transmitted frantic alerts to the council. They were too slow. Already, the Sithari were beginning independent experiments based on human recursive doubt theories. The T-Scren initiated a clandestine study of non-consensus social models, a concept they once deemed heretical. Even a few cautious Aelthi's observers secretly reviewed Rourke's historical records of Earth's technological surges after devastating wars and systemic collapses. The hall of abstract concordance began to fracture, not with violence but with questions, dangerous questions, questions they had forgotten how to ask. As Rourke was led away from the demonstration, Vorquest spoke in a tight, pained whisper. "You have sown a virus among us." Rourke glanced back at the gathering crowd, faces lit with the raw fire of a different kind of hunger. He smiled. "Good." The council scrambled to enact damage control. Protocols were drafted to restrict human data access further, to counterpropagate reinforcing logical purities, to insulate the major civilizations from contamination. Yet even as they tightened their grip, anomalies began to surface. Young scholars defected. Minor houses adopted unstable models of inquiry. Fractured philosophies propagated through quantum mimetic channels. And amidst it all, Jason Rourke prepared for his next move. Because he hadn't come alone. Earth, once dismissed as a primitive footnote, had sent more than just one backpack of madness. They had sent a seed. And seeds, once planted, do not politely stay inert. They grow, especially in places that have forgotten how to change. The fractures within the hall widened over the next dozen cycles. In secret, across sectors once deemed immutable, alien scholars began replicating Rourke's unorthodox methods. Unauthorized experiments bloomed in hidden laboratories. Subversive art collectives arose among species whose cultures had abolished aesthetic rebellion centuries ago. Libraries that had once preserved only verified thought forms now pulsed with heretical editions, anonymous treatises riddled with paradoxes and impossible questions. Jason Rourke moved through this growing storm like a patient gardener. He met with those who approached him under the guise of controlled interviews. He answered questions not with declarations but with provocations. When asked for truth, he responded with challenges. When pressed for certainty, he gave them choices. He never imposed, he only suggested, and it was enough. The Council's countermeasures faltered. Doctrinal purity programs, once flawlessly enforced through socio-cognitive feedback systems, began encountering anomalies. In rare cases, entire educational nexuses collapsed under the pressure of internal debate. Some alien minds could not survive the stress of embracing contradiction. Others mutated in extraordinary ways, generating innovations that startled even their creators. At first, the Council blamed each other. Accusations of sabotage flew in encrypted bursts across the network of trusted delegates. Investigations yielded nothing because it was not sabotage. It was infection. Not of the body, but of the spirit. One night cycle, deep within the Scholar Quarter, Rourke met with a clandestine assembly known simply as the New Inquiry. Representatives from 11 species had gathered, wearing holographic veils to obscure their identities from surveillance. The meeting place was a forgotten amphitheater carved into the base of Tarvan's lowest strata, a place abandoned after a philosophical heresy 5 millennia earlier. The leader of the group, a skeletal being known as Enthalu of the Hishari, addressed Rourke first. "We have studied your culture's methods of dynamic contradiction," Enthalu said, voice creaking like ancient wood. "We wish to adapt these methods to ourselves." Rourke crossed his arms. "You know what that means, right? You're not just tweaking the edges, you're fundamentally changing your civilization's path. Once you start, there's no going back to the old stability." A T-Scren academic shifted uncomfortably. "We understand, the Council would destroy us if they knew." "Not destroy," Enthalu corrected. "Purge, erase, cauterize the infection to preserve the static ideal." Rourke pulled a new item from his ever-reliable backpack, a slim, hardbound book with the title On the Origin of Species. He placed it at the center of their circle. "This is about more than your culture's surviving," he said. "It's about them evolving. The difference between extinction and transcendence isn't who has the strongest walls, it's who adapts fastest when the world changes." They leaned closer. Enthalu reached out a skeletal hand to touch the book, as if handling a sacred relic. "You must teach us," Enthalu whispered. Rourke nodded once. "I will, but not by giving you answers, only by giving you the tools to find your own." Thus began the real work. Within hidden forums, Rourke introduced human concepts long abandoned by the Council. Open-ended inquiry, adversarial debate, contrarian hypothesis formation, collaborative anarchy, and iterative prototyping of unsanctioned ideas. He taught them how to think without permission. Small victories appeared first. New formulations of energy conversion emerged from the hybrid thoughts of a Silithian T-Scren working group. Art that could not be catalogued or measured by traditional standards began to appear in sublevel corridors, inspiring emotions that defied classification. Young scholars defected from state academies, seeking a life where inquiry mattered more than approval. And then came the first open rebellion. A minor race, the Velikar, regarded as subservient bureaucrats for eons, declared philosophical independence. They cited Rourke's teachings, naming humanity's model of resilient uncertainty as their inspiration. They refused to participate in the standard cognitive alignments demanded by the Council. They began broadcasting chaotic, unrefined transmissions into open channels. The Council's response was immediate and brutal. Velikar ambassadors were recalled, their archives were frozen, trade agreements collapsed. Sanctions of memory erasure were prepared, stripping away entire generations' worth of knowledge from their neural banks. But the Velikar didn't surrender. They adapted. They hacked ancient thought-shielding systems, repurposing them to scatter their knowledge across quantum sublayers where it could not be so easily purged. They fragmented their culture intentionally, creating multiple divergent versions of themselves to survive whatever retaliation came. It was, Rourke realized, the first real proof that humanity's infection was irreversible. He watched the Council scramble to contain the breach. Sailro himself led emergency sessions, invoking laws not cited since the time before half the Hall's current members even existed. Entire thought bundles were marked as quarantined. Open dissent was treated as a virus to be surgically excised. Yet no matter how swiftly they moved, the spread continued. Rourke remained calm. He knew what the Council did not. You cannot unplant a seed by cutting down a single branch. Roots had already spread beneath their flawless towers of thought, cracking foundations they no longer remembered how to repair. And then one evening cycle, Vorquez approached him in private. No guards, no surveillance drones. The Guardian Observer, once a loyal instrument of the Accord's stability, stood before Rourke with a strange gleam in his faceted eyes. I have reviewed, Vorquest said, voice taut, what you carry. I have seen the implications. Rourke waited. I have concluded, Vorquest hesitated, a hesitation unthinkable for a Silithian, that your species does not merely disrupt, you enable resurgence, renewal through instability. And Rourke asked quietly. Vorquest stepped forward, a subtle ripple of rebellion moving through his body. And I wish to learn. That night Rourke opened his backpack once more. And this time he did not share just one book or one philosophy. He shared humanity's truest legacy, the unending hunger to question everything, even when the answers tore down the sky. The Council's era was ending. They just didn't know it yet. The revolt was no longer philosophical, it was systemic. Within mere rotational cycles, the new inquiry's influence fractured the structure of the Hall of Abstract Concordance itself. What had begun as isolated pockets of ideological deviation evolved into coordinated movements of thought insurgency. Entire archival nodes fell under the control of reformist factions. Communications encrypted in chaotic recursive logic patterns, impossible to predict or intercept by traditional means, swept through the satellite academies tethered to Tarvan. The Council moved to reclaim authority. They deployed enforcement constructs, AI-augmented custodians of cognitive order, trained to identify and neutralize divergent ideation patterns. Debate halls turned into silent battlegrounds where minds were assaulted, not with weapons, but with overwhelming waves of corrective logic meant to overwrite rebellious thought processes. It worked on some. Others shattered under the pressure. But a growing number adapted, much faster than any projection allowed. They did not resist with sheer stubbornness. They bent, absorbed, reconfigured. Ideas were not simply defended, they were weaponized, morphed into unpredictable forms that slipped past traditional defenses like mercury through a closed fist. Jason Rourke watched this new phase unfold from the ruins of an abandoned cognition lab deep within Tarvan's ancient strata. With him were representatives of the now openly declared Accordant Reformation. Vorquest stood by his side, no longer an observer but a strategist. The skeletal Nthalu drafted countermeasures in a language invented just days earlier. T-Scren probabilists mapped future timelines with the jagged artistry of chaos theory stolen from Earth's oldest dreamers. You realize, Vorquest said, they will move against you personally now, not your ideas, you. Rourke tightened the straps of his battered backpack. Good, that means they're scared. A communique arrived. Not a demand, not a threat. An invitation. Sailro himself had called for a formal confrontation of reason, an ancient rite where a dissident could present their full case before the assembled council. If victorious by consensus, reform would be sanctioned. If defeated, all traces of the heresy would be eradicated from the archives and the offender's mind atomized into the void. There had not been such a confrontation in 70 millennia. The Reformation debated the risks. Many feared a trap. Some proposed outright rejecting the summons and continuing the insurgency unchecked. Rourke made the decision simple. We go, he said, we don't hide, we never hid. On the appointed cycle, under the searing white corona of Tarvan's perigee sun, Jason Rourke walked into the grand chamber of the council once again. This time he was not alone. He was flanked by Vorquest and Nthalu, 3 T-Scren polymaths, and a Velikar scholar whose fractal skin bore fresh battle scars from the Council's enforcement raids. Behind them, streaming into the hall in numbers impossible to ignore, came the new thinkers, the artists of paradox, the engineers of impossible machines, the singers of untold harmonies. The hall was split down its luminous heart. On one side the old order, dignified, furious, desperate. On the other, the new, fractured, uncertain, burning with dangerous possibility. Sailro stood at the pinnacle, his bioluminescence dimmed to a colorless rage. You, he intoned, have disrupted the sacred continuity. You have fractured harmonies that took eons to construct. Rourke stepped forward, his voice carrying without augmentation, powered by nothing but will. No, we revealed the cracks you pretended not to see. We reminded you that continuity without growth is just a slow death. Gasps, genuine gasps, rippled through the assembly. You offer instability, collapse, Sailro accused. I offer evolution, Rourke countered. Not the clean, gradual kind you dream about, the violent, messy, necessary kind. You can either adapt or be remembered as the last priests of a dying order. The confrontation demanded structure. Each side would present a series of proofs. The council chose first, displays of logical architectures so precise they could stabilize planetary weather systems, ethical matrices that had eradicated war across 10,000 worlds. Rourke let them speak without interruption. When his time came, he reached into his battered backpack. He did not pull out diagrams, he did not offer mathematical theorems. He pulled out stories. A collection of human myths, epics, fables, tales of failure, love, betrayal, rebirth, narratives that contradicted themselves yet held deeper truths than any static axiom could trap. He spoke of Prometheus, who defied the gods to bring fire to humanity and suffered for it. He spoke of Newton, whose vision of a clockwork universe eventually shattered under the revelations of quantum uncertainty. He spoke of civilizations that rose and fell and rose again, each cycle seeding the next in ways no deterministic system could have forecast. "You think your harmony is strength," Rourke said, "but it is only delay. Every system you have built will eventually face a challenge it cannot model, a variable it cannot assimilate. We are that variable. We are the anomaly you cannot sterilize because we don't seek the perfect answer." He paused, meeting Sailro's multifaceted gaze without flinching. "We seek better questions." The hall quivered as thought forms clashed invisibly across its crystalline surfaces. The vote began. Traditionalists voted first, an overwhelming rejection. Then came the second wave, the Reformation delegates, their numbers larger than anyone had dared hope. Their votes were not unanimous, some abstained, others fractured further into their own splinter beliefs. But it was enough. By the laws written long before any of them had drawn breath, the confrontation required only a one-third plurality to stay execution of an idea. The threshold was crossed. Barely. The council collapsed into stunned silence. Sailro staggered as if physically struck, his luminescence sputtering. "You have doomed us all," he whispered. "No," Rourke said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder once more. "We just woke you up." The ruling was sealed. The Hall of Abstract Concordance would no longer be a singular council of ordered thought. It would become what it feared most, a living, breathing forum of collision, fracture, regeneration. A system that, like humanity itself, would survive not by perfection, but by relentless, furious adaptation. The galaxy was about to change. And humanity, once a dismissed footnote, now stood at its molten heart. The declaration rippled outward like a supernova, not of light, but of thought. With the confrontation concluded and the ruling irrevocable by the ancient laws of the Hall, no member species could unmake what had been affirmed. Even those who opposed the decision were now bound by it. The implications detonated across galactic space with all the violence of a paradigm rupturing. The Hall of Abstract Concordance was no longer a monument to unity. It had become a battleground of ideas. Rourke didn't stay at the center, that wasn't the human way. He left the Grand Chamber the day after the ruling with Vorques and Enthalu in tow, descending into the substrata levels of Tarvan where a new kind of academy was being forged, not from polished crystal or sterile logic, but from abandoned spaces lit by flickering terminals, patched with arguments and raw, living intellect. It was called the Crucible. There, species who had once feared deviation came to debate, to learn, to build and tear down in the same breath. Failure was allowed, encouraged, even because within failure was the seed of mutation, and within mutation was the hope of new horizons. Rourke taught not from a podium but from a circle. Every question was met with a counter-question. Every conclusion was pulled apart until it revealed its hidden assumptions. And still the council did not die. It adapted slowly, painfully. Some of its members departed, others remained and watched from a distance. Sailro himself withdrew from public deliberation, retreating to the Aelthais core-worlds to meditate upon a future he had spent eons trying to prevent. But the war had moved beyond him. Humanity, once locked behind the bars of observation only, began to receive visitors. They came not as overseers but as students. Tiskren scholars walked through the ruins of Earth's oldest cities, tracing the scars of our mistakes like sacred glyphs. Silithian engineers studied our flawed machines and found in them new patterns of redundancy and grace. The shimmering ones, once disgusted by our chaotic semiotics, began composing linguistic systems based on our metaphors, symbols that flexed and morphed under context, just as life did. Earth itself became something else. Not a capital, not a throne. A forge. The United Terran Cooperative, seeing what Rourke had accomplished, reorganized its spaceward strategy, not to dominate but to catalyze. Human ships became known not for their firepower but for their unpredictability. They showed up where no one expected. They helped failing colonies no one else remembered. They spread libraries, code, raw thought. And wherever they went, the stagnation broke. Not cleanly, not without consequence. Some species collapsed under the weight of self-questioning. Others spiraled into cultural fracturing, struggling to find identity amid sudden freedom. There were tragedies, revolutions, mass disillusionments, but always, what emerged afterward was more than what came before. The Crucible's influence spread, not by decree but by contagion. Its model was adopted across the galaxy under 1,000 different names. Some called it the human sickness. Others, more respectfully, the flame. Jason Rourke never claimed credit. He spent his days deep in the Crucible's experimental forums, arguing with shape-shifting philosophers, drawing diagrams in Martian dust, correcting young minds who thought the goal was to imitate humans. "It's not about being like us," he told them one night when a Sithari student insisted they'd found the formula for human innovation. "It's about being unlike what you were told you had to be." Voorquest, now co-director of Crucible operations, watched from the shadows. He had shed the last vestiges of Council protocol, his once pristine form now laced with adaptive neural filaments developed from hybrid cognition. He no longer observed, he participated. Even Enthalu, whose brittle form had once shivered under uncertainty, now led discussions on the nature of recursive selfhood, drawing from Earth's discarded theories of identity and layering them with Hishari teleomotive patterns. He was more than he had ever been, and he knew it. And Earth changed too. No longer the center of its own narrative, it flourished in partnership. Its people, scattered across reformed alliances and emergent cultures, became known not for their dominance but for what they left behind in others. A tendency, a fault line, a spark. And still, not everyone accepted the change. There were purges, there were wars. Old orders tried to rise again, painting humanity as a corruptor, a destabilizing force that brought entropy to civilization. Some worlds fell to this rhetoric. Some even sealed themselves away, rejecting the Crucible entirely. But they were fewer each cycle. Because entropy, Rourke had once said, wasn't the end, it was the beginning of movement. And movement meant evolution. On the edge of known space, a new initiative began, the Liminal Expansion Protocol. A collaborative fleet built by 28 species, each with different models of reason, art, and risk, prepared to enter a region of space long thought inaccessible due to cognitive mimetic hazards. At the head of the initiative was a ship called Unresolved, captained by a descendant of Jason Rourke, not chosen by bloodline but by temperament. She carried with her a new kind of archive, one not built on absolutes but on contradictions, questions, and errors, the Crucible in motion. In her first broadcast, she quoted something her ancestor once scrawled on a page in the back of a book filled with crossed-out ideas. "We are not the answer, we are the challenge. We are the thing you can't solve but can't ignore. We are humanity, and we are unfinished by design." The galaxy listened. And for the first time in its long, careful history, it listened not to preserve, but to change.